Welcome back. So today we're talking about Karl Marx. The reading was some selections from the German ideology. Can be a difficult read, so I'll try to distill some of the main ideas from this piece and integrating it with some sort of outside understanding I have of Marx to give you a general sense of his philosophy. So Marx's approach is called dialectical materialism, and I'll do a little work to explain what that means. So you could compare him a little bit to Descartes in that he's anti-dogmatic, right? He's not just going to accept beliefs that have been passed down to him. Instead, he's going to doubt all dogmas, and particularly religious dogmas. Later, he thinks all those sort of dogmas are actually tools of the ruling class to manipulate the lower class. Um, but unlike Descartes, he's not a rationalist, right? You recall Descartes doubted all sensory information and said, really, the only things you can know have to begin uh, with your knowledge of your own mind. Uh, Marx is more of an empiricist, right? He believes what he accepts as true is material reality. So since he's a studier of history, right, and of human society, uh, the material reality which he's primarily interested in is humans and the history of human development. So his approach to the study of history is in many ways a reaction to or an adaptation of a previous philosopher named Hegel. So Hegel sort of does a history of the world as a sort of succession of ideas, right? So during, you know, maybe the time of the Greeks, certain ideas are prevalent, uh, and then they have these fundamental sort of contradictions that come to attention, and then there's sort of overthrowing of old ideas and a new sort of age of history comes, right? And there's this succession. And Hegel, if you try to read him, he's even harder to read than Marx. Very abstract, but it's a succession of newer and newer ideas, and we can trace the history of the world through that. Marx is against grounding his approach to history in ideas. Again, he's focused on the material world, human bodies, right? What humans need to survive, some basics like food, right? And the things that humans produce. And by focusing on that, right, you'll come to recognize certain social interactions are necessitated, and you'll see history from the perspective of um, simply the material goods that humans produce and require. The materialism part of dialectical materialism is this focus on the material world and not on ideas. The dialectic we'll come to understand a little bit later. So for Marx, humans become distinctly human, as opposed to other animals, when they become able to produce their own means of subsistence. In other words, at a certain point in their development, right, human beings begin to produce their own food, right, through farming, produce their own clothing, produce their own shelter, tools, and so on. They don't just, find a rock in nature and throw it at a bird or something like that. They actually sort of build spears and sophisticated uh, tools and other implements, right? Technologies. This is what separates us from other animals for Marx. And in fact, he goes even further to say that mode of production, right, used by humans to generate the things they need is the essence of humanity at any given stage of development, right? So this distinction from Hegel, who thought the essence of humanity at any historical stage was our consciousness or ideas. Marx says no, it's a material way of life, right? How do we produce the goods we need? So as we learn to produce our own means of subsistence, of course, the population is going to explode, and so mode of production is also always going to be embedded in a society, right? As an interaction among humans, humans are going to be essentially social, and so any understanding of the materialistic aspect of humans will have to involve these social relations. So as we progress, right, from you know early hunter-gatherers to agriculturalists to more sophisticated sorts of societies and sophisticated modes of production, uh, eventually each human is not going to produce every single thing they need to survive. And we're going to specialize. I might build tables, and I'm going to sell my tables to get money to go buy food, right? Not everyone is a farmer, not everybody is making their own clothes. These The broadest sort of division that emerges early on is between agricultural areas, right? The typically out in the country where food is produced, and then in the town where you have the craftspeople and eventually the factories with the capitalist owners. The, so you can understand division of labor in terms of ownership, right? The division of labor is divided by who owns what. So the capitalist owns the factory. The worker only owns their labor, right? That's the only thing they can sell. Some small craftspeople might own their own business, right? They might own the materials that they use to, tea kettles or whatever. Some farmers might own their own land. So labor is divided in part by what you own, right? And so we see this progression and changes in the division of labor from smaller tribes to city states with slaves, empires, military states like the British Empire. And Marx, again, thinks that the most important thing to keep track of, right, in this broad development of history, modes of production, the division of labor, and the interaction among people as far as production. So one important stage of development that Mark talks about a fair amount in this German ideology is feudalism, right? So in feudalism, you have large landowners who rent their land to peasants to farm it. So this is a very right country-centered, sort of spread out form of production, and this is the dominant form of production in ages. And there is a tension with the sorts of production that go on in the cities. So in the cities, you have small business people that maybe have saved up some capital, right? Maybe have some machinery that they use in production. Um, so they sort of own the means of production as well as the products, and they're also the laborers. Might also have not small businessmen, but mere laborers who just work for a wage and only have their labor to sell. Um, at this stage, you don't quite have, huge businesses. You don't have the Walmarts and the giant factories yet. And in fact, what you have are craft guilds. These are associations of, be it blacksmiths or leather workers or whatever, that sort of actively work to prevent large monopolies. But at this stage of history, according to Marx, there's really only a very coarse division of labor um, compared to the more developed factory systems. So, in this feudalist society, the farmer's doing all of the plowing, the planting, the harvesting, right? It's not split up. These days, often migrant laborers to do all the harvesting, and you use machines to do the planting and so on. Um, you have a shoemaker who makes every part of the shoe, right? Who buys the materials, who owns the tools they need to make the shoe, and they put together everything from the sole to the laces, right? Nowadays, a shoe factory, you've got an owner that owns the whole factory and all the tools. Then you have some people that work one station in this production line, right? One person puts on the soles, another person just laces them up, and so on. So early on in feudal society, we don't have this extreme division of labor that we'll see later in more advanced capitalist societies. So Marx is, reacting to Hegel, adapting Hegel to his own purposes, and so he spends a fair amount of time attacking Hegel. Um, but Hegel is difficult to understand. I only know a little, um, studied some of Hegel, but he's notoriously obscure, right? But the general idea is that history progresses according to Hegel as a development of ideas, what he calls the world spirit, right? So every stage of history, there's a dominant idea that governs uh, society, and each idea, which he calls a thesis, has its antithesis, right? Which is sort of opposite, which eventually the thesis and antithesis come into conflict, and they create a synthesis of the two that creates a new kind of idea. You have the dawn of a new era of history and social relations, and the process goes on and on. This new idea created the synthesis of the previous ideas, then it develops its own antithesis. You have a new synthesis, and so on. So this is very abstract, but Hegel is very abstract. So, for example, for Hegel, feudalism, like every stage of history, there's certain internal contradictions in its basic conception that makes it unstable and gives way to this new stage of history. Um, Marx has a similar idea, but he doesn't think those contradictions are abstract or they're ideas that are in conflict. Rather, they're concrete material modes of production. People, actual people trying to feed themselves, make shoes that are creating these tensions. You have different classes with different interests, right, that are in tension with each other, the town versus and so on. And so it's not the ideas that are moving history forward, it's the people and their material relations. But the overall process is pretty similar for Marx. It's still what we call a dialectic between two opposing forces. For Hegel, it was ideas, right, the thesis and the antithesis. And for Marx, it is material forces, class forces, modes of production. This is the dialectic, right? This interaction between two forces. Dialectical materialism. Marx has a little to say about consciousness, right? So again, Hegel was very concerned with ideas as the motive force of history. Marx places ideas in a different role in our world. So he does have an account of consciousness, and it is influential even to this day, even for scholars that aren't necessarily Marxists in their view of economics. This idea of consciousness, and in particular false consciousness, is still very popular today. So for Marx, consciousness is the result of social interaction. Without other people, and in particular without language, there's no need for consciousness. Us becoming conscious beings is the result of our needing to interact with other humans. What this means is that the form your consciousness will take is determined by the sort of society you live in, right? So if you're engaged in different types of social interactions, the nature of your consciousness will be different. Your consciousness is not entirely your own, right? It is created and shaped by the society you live in. And this gives rise to the notion of false consciousness. Your consciousness, your own desires and beliefs, right, at the level of consciousness are actually against your own material interests. They've been instilled in you by society, but they're going against your interests. And um, this notion has been adopted by what we call critical theorists who apply this to sort of theories of gender and race. So you have, typically people in the lower classes or people who are in oppressed groups, right? They're told by society uh, to believe, to have certain beliefs about themselves that are actually not in their own interests, right? And there's this general suspicion in Marx of ideas, right, as reflecting oppression, right, social influence rather than material reality. So back to the sort of development of the division of labor, he finds the initial division of labor in the family, right? So it's the smallest form of society and the most basic of labor. So labor is divided between husband and wife along gender lines. Typically, right, the man being the master and the wife and the children being a kind of slave, at least according to Marx, right? And of course, there's going to be an internal contradiction within the family between the interests of these various members, right? So, man is acting as the master, they're going to have certain interests that are going to be in conflict with those members of the family that are acting as slave. And so, when you are in a situation where you are not able to act in your own interests and you have to act in the interests of a master, um, this is what Marx calls alienation. Right? So your labor is no longer your own, it serves something else, and alienation will be a constant form of society throughout history until you get to communism. Right? So when you go to work, right, your labor no longer becomes your own, it becomes your boss's, and that is alienation. You're spending 8 hours a day not working in your own interests, selling your labor to someone else for a wage. So as society expands from the basic family unit right into more complicated organizations, this basic division between master and slave becomes more complicated. You have more classes. You'll have peasants, clergy, aristocracy, kings, but the basic principle is the same in each case. Division of labor will create different classes, and members of lower classes will have their labor alienated from them, right? They will not be working in their own interests. And this will create a tension, an antagonism, right, between and among classes, right? So again, sort of a layer cake. So classes in the middle are being exploited by the ones above them, but also want to exploit the ones below them. And they're going to want to resist exploitation by the classes above. They also want to um, deal with the resistance of the classes they are exploiting. So creates class struggle, and every class struggle is a struggle to destroy the social arrangement and produce a new one, and move on to a new stage of history. And the dialectic, the thesis and the antithesis, not in terms of ideas, but in terms of classes whose material interests, right, are butting up against each other. And eventually you have revolution and new society, new stage of history. So in a more modern economy, right, as the world economy expands, becomes more interconnected, all of these various class struggles begin to coalesce, right, into sort of a ruling class and a large class of workers, which you'll call the proletariat. So this is not the case in many earlier stages of history, right? There might have been the merchant class of one country engaging in a struggle with the aristocracy. There might be an evolution, but in some other country, they might be at an earlier form of, stage of development, and there would be different class struggle going on. But as capitalism becomes, right, the worldwide mode of production, uh, you're going to have the class lines being the same all over the world. And in that situation, there's no longer any hope of escaping your class by simply moving to another country, right? The only way out will be revolution. So once again, the late stage of capitalism where it's worldwide and where the class struggle is very stark and very clearly defined, and there's no escape from it, um, that's where you get a communist revolution. And this is not, he's not so much a cheerleader for the proletariat, right, or proponent of communism, and I think he is on some level. But you see in his writing, he thinks he's just doing the science of history, right? He's describing what has happened through history and what he can predict will happen in history, right? And he's not necessarily it's good or bad. It's all stages that have to um, be passed through, right? So there's nothing wrong per se with feudalism, right? It's just something that happened that is necessary to give way to the next stage, and so on. So both Hegel and Marx predicted an end of history, right? So the dialectic does end at a certain point. Hegel thought it was sort of like in contemporary Germany at the time was like the end of history. Uh, Marx sees his in the future, right? Uh, he sees the ultimate clash between the proletariat and the capitalists, with the proletariat winning, and this be a worldwide phenomenon, right? Um, the proletariat, the workers will seize the means of production from the capitalists. Private property will be eliminated, and private property, that's the source of all class distinction. Without private property, you don't have class struggle, and you stop this endless dialectic, and you reach will also be the end of alienation, right? So humans will no longer be selling their labor to others. The workers will own the factories. Um, every part of humanity is working for humanity as a whole. So again, the story is parallel to Hegel's, but instead of based in ideas, it's based in material reality. So I hinted at this idea before, ideological critique. So Marx argues that the dominant ideas in any time and place are going to be those of the ruling class, and this is what he calls ideology. Now, it's not always explicit ideology. It's kind of more like the air you breathe, right? It's the background assumptions that you work within. But the way it functions is to keep the exploited classes from trying to take power by convincing them that um, the way things are right now is just natural and eternal, right, and could never be any different. So one example of ideology is stereotypes, right? So there are feminine stereotypes, right, of women as being naturally nurturing and caregiving and sort of servile or deferent, right, to other people. Um, and those are often described as just natural, right, biological women. And this has the effect of keeping women in roles, right, like caregiving, um, right, fam, nurturing children, and in general being servants, right. In our own society, I mean, maybe when I mentioned in the finals, right, in communism, private property goes away, you may have thought, how in the heck does that work, right? Do I have a car to drive to work? Do I get to have my own clothes? Do I have a bed? It seems like impossible or insane to you. Marx would argue that is simply you're being blinded by ideology, right? You sort of live in a capitalist society where the assumption is that private property is the only way to exist, right? But again, that Marx would argue is simply a lie fed to you, right, from the ruling class, who has a lot of private property compared to yours. So the proletariat plays a huge role in Marx's history. This is the working class. This is the class that Marx believes will initiate a communist revolution. So, in modern capitalism, the division of labor, in one way, becomes extreme and simply binary, right? You have the owners, right? So no one person is like a little craftsman in a a medieval own the tools that you use to make shoes, and you buy the materials, and you own the shoes, and you own your shop, and you own the products of your labor. Um, in modern industrial society, there's a factory, all the tools and all the materials are owned by the factory owner, and then all the workers come and sell their labor, right, to produce shoes or whatever. So, you have sort of assembly line situation. Each person is only doing one relatively simple task, and that's what they do all day, right, in exchange for a wage, and the capitalist owns everything. But paradoxically, this actually gives the workers the most power because they're the only class actually producing anything, right? The factory owner is actually superfluous, right? All they do is own stuff, they don't actually do anything. And so once the proletariat sort of breaks free of the ideology that's been keeping them in place, they can seize power, run the factory. So the last thing I want to say about Marx is whether or not you noticed it, or is there's sort of a distinct absence of moralism in Marx. So he's not running around saying how bad capitalists are and how great, how moral it is to be communist. He's really just, he thinks he's doing a science of history. He's just describing, he's not necessarily recommending. Um, so religion and all the morality associated with religion to him is just more ideology, right? It's just being used by the ruling class to keep the lower classes down and convinced that, their suffering is necessary to some divine plan. Um, But he doesn't think that all the exploitation that's happened through history is a bad thing. It's a necessary thing, right? That's how history progresses, and that's how you get to the end of history. Um, so he seems to be think he's just describing matters of empirical fact and making predictions of what will happen next. All right, next we will talk about Adam Smith, a very different approach to um, economics.